I'd like to thank the Melbourne Press Club for hosting the event, and also like to thank the panellists for coming along today to talk about a hugely important topic, whistleblowers. It's one of the most important issues for the media, corporate Australia and politics, because over the past few decades, some of the biggest scandals would never have come to light without the courage of whistleblowers. Sometimes they're anonymous, such as Deep Throat and Watergate. Sometimes it's a package of documents in a brown paper bag that suddenly appear in the mail. And other times it's off-the-record conversations using the confidentiality protection. In Australia, we've had a suite of whistleblowers over the past few years who've helped expose scandals such as the Reserve Bank's security, bribery and corruption by some of our high-profile companies. The most notable is the recent Unaoil scandal, which embroiled Leighton. We've had the Panama Papers, wage exploitation at 7-Eleven, and the various financial scandals. They've all helped bring us to the point of a debate about whether or not we should have a royal commission into banking. One of the most famous whistleblowers is Jeff Morris, who blew the whistle on CBA's financial planning scandal in 2009, firstly going to our corporate regulator ASIC, and he'll tell you what happened there. For me, I've worked with many different whistleblowers during my career, and without them, we would not know about misconduct inside CBA, NAB, IOOF, 7-Eleven, and most recently, CBA again with CommInsure. And that was probably one of the most egregious of all, which was exposed thanks to Dr. Benjamin Coe, the Chief Medical Officer. Some of the topics I would like to discuss today include the personal impact on whistleblowers, whether we're doing enough to protect them, and should the right of a whistleblower be improved with legislation. In the US, there's a reward system of up to 30% of proceeds if a whistleblower goes to the SEC. Given most either end up losing their job or become the subject of smear campaigns, is that something we should have here? So on that note, I would like to thank each panellist to talk to us for a few minutes, and firstly kicking off with Jeff Morris.
Well, thanks Adele. My story goes back to 2008, so that's a lot of ground to cover. Back then I was a financial planner at CBA looking for a quiet life, and there was another financial planner there by the name of Don Newen who'd been suspended. An elderly couple came in to see me one day and they were physically distressed because $500,000 of their money had been vaporised and they couldn't get an explanation out of anybody at CBA. I realised very shortly afterwards that the customer experience people at CBA, whose job was to help these customers, were lying to them and trying to cover it up. And a clear-cut case for compensation, in my view, was going to be denied. At the same time, I saw the files of this financial planner being sanitised. The next thing that happened was Don Newen came back from suspension and was promoted and was turned loose to try and hose down these victims. There was a management conspiracy to cover this up. So there were a couple of other planners who'd seen people in the same situation I had. In the typical Australian way, we had a meeting in the pub to come up with a plan of action, and we decided to write to ASIC. There wasn't much point, we thought, going internally because it seemed like pretty much the entire management team was in on the cover-up. Now, even at that stage, this is September 2008, one of my colleagues said to me, "But mate, that's no good, ASIC is useless. Everybody knows that." And I said, well, maybe they are. We'll just have to shame them into doing their job. And if need be, we'll go to the media to force them to do their job. Famous last words. So we sent a report to ASIC in October 2006. It was about 6 pages long. It's still available on the Senate Inquiry website as part of one of my submissions. And in that we spelt everything out. What we found was that trying to get ASIC to act on this was literally like flogging a dead horse. So after about 8 or 9 months of it being moved from department to department at ASIC, and we're looking at it, watching the files being sanitised and the clients being lied to, we decided we'd better do something to give ASIC a bit of a G-up, so we leaked it to trade press, a small article in the trade press. Well, we didn't get ASIC's attention, because it takes a lot to do that, but of course CBA, it was like a bomb going off there. The next thing you know, Don Nguyen had resigned, and CBA had even voluntarily put their hands up and sent a breach report to ASIC. This is after 8 or 9 months of trying to cover it up. Anyway, the management knew who'd leaked that stuff, so I thought in for a penny, in for a pound. And I sent a memo to the top 3 executives at CBA. Again, pretty much covering what we'd sent to ASIC. 2 of them were executive directors on the board of CBA. This is June 2009. And at the same time, I marched into CBA Group Security and laid the whole thing out in front of them. Well, I think that had something to do with Don Nguyen getting sacked in the breach report to ASIC. But the cover-up continued, the clients kept getting lied to, and the files were still being sanitised. At this stage, we're thinking, well, surely ASIC's got to turn up soon. Anyway, another 8 or 9 months went by. February 2010, we couldn't take it anymore. We physically marched into ASIC and literally pounded the table and said, "You got to do something about this." And a couple of weeks later, ASIC finally served a notice to get the files, which we'd asked them to do 18 months earlier. So they'd had 18 months to clean these files up before ASIC ever saw them. ASIC then, it took them nearly 2 years. By late 2011, October 2011 by now, ASIC had imposed what they call an enforceable undertaking on CBA, and that's kind of a gentleman's agreement that they'll stop being bad boys. And ASIC had put in place this kind of compensation scheme that looked all right on paper, but the big problem was CBA was left alone to implement it. So the clients were still getting fobbed off. The clients who'd lost $500,000, who were getting offered nothing initially, were now getting offered like $5,000 to go away. So I watched that going on for a bit longer. In February 2013, I left CBA, and I might say ASIC did absolutely nothing to help me. Before I left, I tried to meet with the CEO. There wasn't any interest in, they knew who I was, there wasn't any interest in me meeting with the CEO, because I think a lot of the time, people don't want to know the things you're going to tell them. I left CBA though with a goal, and that was to get a parliamentary inquiry into what had gone on and ASIC's incompetence, because, and I'm sure you all realise this, most royal commissions come out of a parliamentary inquiry. Fortunately, I fell in with a journalist called Adele Ferguson, who started to run like an avalanche of stories in June 2013. And a couple of weeks later, a national senator called John Wacker Williams, got up, called for a Senate inquiry, and he got a unanimous vote in the Senate. And at that stage, after the inquiry was called, I wrote a letter to the chair of CBA, and I said, look, I don't think you guys are getting the full story. I will come in and give you and the board a briefing. This is at the start of a parliamentary inquiry. But no, the letter came back, no thank you. You know, imagine the things that I could have told them that they presumably didn't want to hear. Well, that inquiry ran for nearly a year. In May 2014, they put out a 547-page Senate report. It was an inquiry into ASIC, and here's the significant thing. There were over 500 submissions to that inquiry. It was a record for a parliamentary inquiry. And pretty much every one of them was highly critical of ASIC for having let people down in one way or another. Now, the committee themselves said, quite frankly, we really only had time to look at a few of these submissions. And just park that thought for later, because imagine what a Royal Commission could do with those hundreds of submissions that the parliamentary inquiry simply don't have the time and resources to deal with. But by the end of the Senate inquiry, CBA's story and ASIC's story had completely fallen apart, and the CBA compensation scheme was exposed for the utter fraud it was, and it was also evident that ASIC had done nothing to supervise that scheme being implemented fairly. So the customers were just left to the tender mercies of CBA. Now, there was a recommendation for a royal commission into CBA coming out of that voluminous Senate report, and they said specifically, we don't make this recommendation lightly. But that's a group of senators who'd weighed the evidence and come to that conclusion. Now, pretty much the moment it hit the airwaves, Matthias Cormann, the finance minister, was saying, well, there won't be a royal commission. And then after a few hours, he got his talking points right and said, well, I have to consider the matter yet, but there probably won't be a royal commission. I actually drove to Canberra to see Matthias Cormann, and I implored him not to let the bank off, at least not to let them off the Royal Commission until they'd at least paid the customers. Well, yet again, we have another compensation scheme being overseen by CBA. Matthias Cormann announced that there'd be no Royal Commission. I think it was about 2 weeks before the CBA AGM, so that worked out well for them. And so CBA is running another compensation scheme. At this stage, I had one meeting with Ian Narev and I offered to help him. And of course, needless to say, my help was not required. I mean, what would I have to offer? What would I know? More recently, of course, we've had the CommInsure scandal, and I would just make the point that one successful claimant at CommInsure that I'm aware of is that financial planner, Don Newen, who resigned from CBA, that was the fellow I reported to ASIC, who's been banned for 7 years. Well, he's actually managed to successfully claim on CommInsure for an income protection policy for the last 7 years. So he's done all right. Now, I'll just quickly end by saying where we are today and why this Royal Commission is needed. As I said, there's one of the arguments is that we've had these inquiries, but the fact is, I've been to several Senate inquiries now. They're run on a shoestring. They have no resources. As I said, they didn't even get to look at most of those 500 submissions. There's a treasure trove of information there. I put in 8 or 9 submissions myself. They didn't even get to look at all of mine. Now, and the fact is, what this would be investigating essentially are all of these past failures by ASIC where they've let people down. So it's a fairly ludicrous proposition to suggest that ASIC should investigate the past failures of ASIC. It's a bit like expecting Caesar to investigate Caesar. So, and some other things have been said about ASIC, about their funding being cut. Well, of course, this was long before their funding was cut. And I would say that funding alone can't fix a rotten culture. And there is a rotten culture at ASIC, just as there is at some of the banks. And what's required to fix that is comprehensive new leadership. What a Royal Commission would also do is pierce the veil of fake contrition that so many of these corporations can hide behind. And it would expose these self-administered compensation schemes for the frauds they are. I said to Matthias Cormann, don't trust them. ASIC trusted CBA and they made monkeys out of them. If you trust them, they'll make a monkey out of you. And if you look at the stats for how many people have been paid in that CBA compensation scheme in the last 2 years, you'll see what I mean. So it would also provide a means to hold the managers and also, very importantly, the boards of these public companies to account. The board of CBA comprehensively failed in this. Victims wrote to them back in 2010, not interested. But most importantly, I've seen too many victims now in too many scandals. It's not just CBA and CommInsure. There's terrible agribusiness ones, the Timber Corps, the Great Southerns. And there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these victims who've got no voice and got no justice. And most of all, I think the Royal Commission is for them to be listened to. Thank you.
My question is to Jeff. Jeff, I read in The Australian this morning that the ASIC chairman, Greg Medcraft, is seeking an extension of his contract. I'd like to ask, is that a slap in the face for all of the victims of the financial scandals that have happened on his watch?
Yes.